pots I make aren't always thrown perfectly. This one, for instance, developed a slight undulation in the top when I created the indented section just beneath the rim. It's not wildly noticeable, yet it becomes obviously apparent when it's sat on the wheel spinning. But through the process of trimming, I should be able to remove most of the irregularities. The first thing I do to correct the undulation in the rim is flip the bowl over and turn the base flat. At the moment it isn't quite level, as the movement in the rim means that when the pot is placed upside down, that same vertical unevenness is now present in the base. So by turning this portion flat, it'll match the rim of the pot, and once flipped back the right way up, the wavering rim should be level. And as I'll still be doing quite a lot of turning work on the interior of this bowl, I slip the outside of the base, turn it the right way up, and then firmly tap center it close to the bottom where the clay is thicker, so the strikes don't indent the walls. And in this instance, I'm focusing my attention on the rim being in the right place. As long as that's spinning centered, I don't mind if the walls beneath it aren't perfectly in the middle, as there's more material in the lower half of this pot, and I'll be able to trim and correct them. For the inside, all I'm really doing is refining the shape. I'm trimming the lip so it comes to a sharper, beveled edge, and then I straighten the section beneath it. I could have spent a bit more time at the throwing stage making sure the interior shape was 100% right, but refinement and shaping like this is something I prefer to do when the pots have turned leather hard, as I feel like I have more control. And the thing is, pots can change shape slightly as they dry out to leather hard, so by trimming the inside at this stage, I know the shape will be more or less exactly how I want it. Yet, I'd also say this is only the case for larger or more individual pots, or vessels that desperately need a bit of attention. And with things like bowls and mugs, which I make hundreds and hundreds of, I generally won't trim the insides of those, as in many ways they're easier shapes to get right, and if I turn the inside of every single one of them, it could potentially be a huge time sink. The curve towards the lower half of this bowl was bowing inward slightly, so I'm turning this part quite aggressively to make a more curvaceous surface, like you'd expect a bowl to have. This was actually made easier by standing up and holding a sharp metal kidney with two hands to force the shape I was after. This left a relatively scratched, coarse surface, so once finished with the metal, I finished the inside curve by burnishing over it with a smooth plastic kidney, which leaves a more uniform surface in its wake. I find it easier to trim the rim on pots like this when it's still attached upright to the wheel, as with my left hand I can feel the thickness of the rim as I turn. This way I know exactly how much material I can remove. It's on these sharp intersections where I need to be most careful though, as if the corner between them is trimmed too thinly, then the upper section could crack and come off. And I'm aiming for an overall thickness of about 4 to 5 millimeters, and perhaps getting thicker slightly towards the bottom. Typically, when trimming, I keep the wheel speed relatively high, as if you turn it too slowly, which you might think would give you more control, it can actually make trimming consistently more difficult and slower, as the region you're trimming simply comes around less, which means the tool has to remain in the same spot for a longer period of time. Yet you also don't want to go really fast. In fact, it's really rare to ever need to use the highest speed, as if something does go wrong when the wheel is spinning really rapidly, it's almost guaranteed that the pot you're making will be destroyed. Removing the undulation on the lower half is going to be more tricky, and the idea is that I spin the pot and I only let the blade remove the clay from the highest point that spins around until it evens out and removes clay consistently. That should get rid of the worst of the wobble, but truth be told, I don't mind if there's a slight undulation in this piece even when I've finished turning it, as any irregularity is only made more obvious by the fact that it's spinning around, and as soon as it comes to a stop and it's stationary, you simply won't see it. I'm not using that as an excuse to make work that's wobbly and irregular. I still work hard to make sure the pots are well thrown, well trimmed and well glazed, but if there's a slight unevenness in them, I really couldn't care less, to a degree of course, but ultimately that is the human, handmade touch coming in, and if it happens to work harmoniously with my angular, trimmed forms, then that's great. With the inside trimmed and the top of the outer form finished, I can slice the bowl off the wheel and begin work on the bottom. I make sure the wheel is clean, where the rim of the pot will come into contact with it, as I don't want anything to lodge into the lip or potentially scratch it, as that would only mean I'd have to do more tidying up later. The pot is tap centered And at this point, I'm focusing on the rim being centered, as compared to, say, the foot, which you can actually see is wavering from side to side slightly. I then secure the bowl in place with 3 lumps of soft clay, which I press firmly against the metal, letting the material that squashes out either side be the clay that holds the pot in place, rather than pushing the clay directly into the rim of the pot, which could potentially distort it, depending on the thickness of the rim. When trimming, I use a variety of tools, and you'll either see these looped steel tools that are cheap and cheerful. They aren't particularly sharp, and their blades wear away quickly. Like you can see here, the blade is definitely not straight, as the metal quickly gets worn away by the abrasive ceramic. The more coarse the body, the faster the wear. But I can still use cheap tools like this that aren't sharp to trim pots to my liking. As processes go, I think trimming is really technique focused. What I mean by that is I can get similar results with these tools and the much sharper, much more expensive tungsten carbide tools. Only I can probably work a bit quicker with these. Tungsten carbide blades are much sharper and harder, and this particular blade has probably trimmed thousands of pots, yet there's still practically zero wear on the blade. Yes, they're probably a bit more blunt, but the edges are still perfectly straight. I guess what I was trying to say with all of that is that when you purchase expensive turning tools, you shouldn't expect them to suddenly make you a better trimmer. In fact, I'd argue that they're more difficult to use compared to their steel counterparts. And the analogy you've probably heard me say 1,000 times by now is that you would never teach someone how to drive using a sports car. And even though I use these tools a lot, I don't solely rely on them. In fact, the steel tools tend to leave a smoother, more burnished surface, so typically they're what I do most of my finishing with. Although, like you saw previously, due to how the shapes of the blades change with use, I need to be really careful with them and really look, as they obviously don't always cut perfectly straight due to the worn out sections in the blade. In fact, I do most of my finishing with these scrapers. These are very simple tools, typically made from steel or aluminium. They get very sharp with use, and they're probably the tool I still, to this day, accidentally cut myself the most with. But, just like the other steel trimmers, this rib also wears with use, and its sides aren't necessarily perfectly flat. But it leaves a lovely smooth surface that isn't chattered, and it also burnishes the clay, creating a smoother, more compressed surface. And before I begin work on the interior of the foot, I make sure that the angle between the foot and the bowl is lovely and crisp. You may notice there's a slight marbling effect on the clay on the foot here. This wasn't totally intentional. I threw this bowl from a lump of clay that I knew had 2 different clay bodies mixed into it, and I thought I'd kneaded the lump well enough to blend them properly, but I guess that wasn't the case. In a way, I don't mind, as it means when this piece is glazed and fired, the toasted clay on the foot may have slight variations in colour and tone, and it actually might end up looking quite nice. The final significant bit of trimming is hollowing out the foot, for which I pretty much always use this same trimmer, due to the shape of its blade. For the initial pass of the foot, I work slowly and very carefully, often holding the tool with 2 hands to keep the blade in place, as any mistakes at this stage could be disastrous. And if I'm not holding the tool with 2 hands, I clasp it really tightly in my fist and gradually work from the centre out towards the foot. This is another tricky technique, and if you are just beginning to trim, don't worry about removing so much material in one swoop. Instead, it's fine to remove it bit by bit, the most important thing being that you feel like you're in control. Now, as for the depth of the foot, it's important that you remove enough material so that visually it looks right. The way I do this is to imagine the bowl I'm making doesn't have a foot at all, and the shape it has without it should be continuous, both on the outside and inside of the foot, and the raised foot itself should look as if it's simply been stuck onto this continuous form. If instead you don't trim away enough material from the bottom and you're left with a cross-section that looks like this, then not only will there be a disparity between the inside and outside of the foot in terms of the level of the walls, but it also means that there's excess weight in the bottom of the bowl that could have been removed. And one of the most crucial parts about making pottery is throwing and trimming it so the walls are even throughout. If you leave a thick section somewhere and the rest of the walls are thin, there's also quite a high chance that the thicker section will crack. as whilst the rest of the walls above it dry out quickly, the thicker section left in the foot will dry out twice as slowly. And it's when pots dry out unevenly that things begin to go wrong. With the correct depth now trimmed, I begin thinning out the sides of the foot before cleaning over the top and beveling the edges both inside and out. These distinct facets will make waxing and glazing the foot easier, as they act as guides almost, visually at least. I then use the smooth side, not the edge, of a plastic kidney to burnish the clay of the foot smooth. I need this part to be neat and tidy, as once fired, the bare clay here will be the only clay on the entire vessel that's visible, so it needs to look good. And then the foot itself is stamped, using this mark I made from a block of porcelain. Porcelain, as it's very durable, and it shrinks a lot from being carved to fired, meaning I can make the symbol itself quite a bit bigger for it to then shrink down to a smaller size that I'm after. I push it into the still leather hard clay and then compress it from either side as the wheel spins to push in any displaced clay. I then very slightly dry the foot out so that I can pick the pot off, like so, without the foot ring itself being distorted, and then it's placed on a very smooth HPL bat, which were gifts from Richard Carter, who made the spinners I use. In fact, many of you might use them too. These are high pressure laminate bats, and they're very strong, don't warp, and are absurdly smooth, which I like as it means the foot itself, which is still relatively soft, can't be imprinted by, say, the grain of wood that you often find on wooden bats and wearboards. And the bowl will stay on this bat until it's completely bone dry. At this point, much of the moisture has left the bowl, which is very apparent by the colour of the pot. It's also now lighter due to the moisture that's evaporated, and this entire bowl now weighs about 1.1 kilograms, which is about 2 pounds, 8 ounces. And the next steps for this piece is for it to be bisque fired, glazed, and then reduction fired. But more on that in a future video. That's all for this week. Thanks so much for taking your time to watch, and like always, I'll see you next time.